Hello and welcome. I'm Victoria Jackson, Marketing Manager here at Apptentive. Today, we are super excited to share new exclusive data from our 2019 Mobile Benchmarks by App Category report. Today, our presenters are Robi Ganguly, Apptentive CEO, and Christy Culp, Apptentive's VP of Customer Success. Before we start, a couple of general housekeeping notes. First, if you have anything to ask Christy or Robi about the topics covered today, or customer communication tips in general, please submit your questions using the open-ended Q&A field in Zoom. You can find that at the center and bottom of your screen. We have saved quite a bit of time at the end for Q&A, and we definitely want to hear from you, so please submit those questions. Second, throughout the webinar, we will be asking our own questions, which you'll see through polls that will pop up on your screen. And lastly, you can engage with us and the panelists on Twitter using hashtag #AppBenchmarks, or by following along our @Apptentive accounts live tweets. We'll be sharing links there for all of the resources that we're covering today. For today's agenda, we'll be covering how customer centricity is no longer a nice to have, regardless of what industry you're in or your app category. Also, how apps in each category compare and compete according to engagement benchmarks. Industry-specific tips for apps in each featured category. We'll be providing key takeaways that you can implement in your own mobile strategy. And of course, we'll have our Q&A. And with that, I'll hand it over to Christy and Robi.
Awesome, thanks, Victoria. Good morning, my name is Robi Ganguly, co-founder and CEO of Apptentive, and I'm here to introduce a little bit about us and why this is relevant to you. So who is Apptentive? Apptentive is a company that has been super focused on collecting customer feedback. For many years, we are privately held, have powered over 250 million customer conversations. We boost engagement over 23x from traditional methods. We work with over 6,000 organizations, and we really focus on why customers feel the way that they do. What this means for you is that we've been working with many of the world's most customer-obsessed brands for years. And as a result, this webinar is to share some of the data that we see across industries that are relevant to you and to your business to help you understand what the best in the world are doing, what you can expect, and how to think about the future path for listening to your customers. Today's customer really expects a truly extraordinary customer experience. That means that your company, your brand, the experiences you provide are not just in competition with people in your category, they're in competition with people like Amazon, Uber, and Starbucks, who have managed to make the mobile device a one-click ordering platform for convenience and extraordinary experiences. But in pursuing that, many of you are really struggling because most brands really only hear from less than 1% of their customers. That is to say that the vast majority of your customers are truly silent. Many of you have gotten familiar and comfortable with listening to what we think of as a vocal minority, particularly people who are complaining. And some of you are fortunate enough to have a really loyal set of customers who are also vocal in their support of you. But most of you are hearing from less than 1% of your customers, and as a result, the vast majority of your customers are not represented in the feedback. That really, really, truly puts you in a challenging place because today's utmost best experienced companies are really fed based upon feedback. Feedback is really crucial to making product decisions about the future. Whether you're working at Starbucks or you're working at Concur, if you are to predict the future, you need more of it. The people we work with these days say that more feedback is always better. And yet you are struggling because there is a response crisis. At the same time that companies are trying to get customer-centric, fewer and fewer customers are actually choosing to respond to traditional methods of collecting feedback via online surveys, email surveys, phone calls, and panels in person. Less than 5% of your customers will actually answer most of these things or tell you anything before they leave. In fact, 19 out of 20 customers will leave when they're unhappy without telling you anything at all, which makes it very hard for you to predict the future, extraordinarily hard to figure out what's going on. This leads to the most important thing, a huge loss in revenue. When customers have a bad experience, they leave really quickly. In fact, over half of them will start engaging with other companies, checking them out, seeing what their services and offerings are like. Half of them will quit doing business immediately with you, and a quarter of them will actually go out and say stuff negatively. So this means that this response crisis leads to a dramatic decrease in revenue from existing customers. But there is some good news in all of this negativity. That is, in mobile, response rates have been climbing year after year over the past 10 years. While we've seen a decline in online survey response rates and opt-in to push notifications, one bright spot is that response rates inside of the digital experience, whether it's on your website or in your app, have been climbing year over year. And so that's what we're here to talk to you about, is what we've been seeing and how this is helping companies out. One really meaningful metric that we'd like to leave you with is that just by reaching out proactively to talking to companies, you are seeing customers 4 times as likely to continue using your app 3 months later. So just by actually getting proactive and reaching out to your customers, you can increase your retention with your customers. Really big win point and kind of the jumping off point for the rest of this. But before we go into some of the benchmarks that are really specific to our customer base and to you, we want to start off by asking you a question. How often do you base your business decisions off of your customers' feedback? We want to use this to kind of judge our audience and help you understand at the end of this how many of your peers there were. So, we'll get this poll going. And you should be seeing the poll now. We'll wait for a couple seconds for you to take a look at that and quickly answer it, and then I will hand it off to Christy to talk about some of the benchmarks. Great, to you, Christy.
All right, thank you, Robi. So before we get started on some of the actual metrics, I wanted to take just a minute to talk about our methodology and the report itself. So to complete our mobile benchmark report, we did analyze customer apps for all of 2018. There is a ton of additional data in the report that we're not going to go over here. We're also doing some blog posts and releasing the individual category data. So please make sure, if you're interested in reading some more, understanding more about our methodology, more about our benchmarks, go ahead and take some time to actually download a copy and go through the benchmark report. All right, so today we're actually going to take an in-depth look about how different app categories compare in 6 areas. Those are interaction and response rates, the love dialogue, which is Apptentive's metric that reflects overall customer happiness, survey response rates, in-app messages, ratings and reviews, and then last but not least, sentiment for open-ended feedback. So we will go through each of those different categories, starting with interaction and response rates. So this refers to the percentage of customers that companies are talking to throughout the year and the percentage of customers that are actually answering back. So on average, companies that work with Apptentive actually interacted with 25% of their customer base in 2018, which is way up from a 12% interaction rate in 2017. By partnering with our customer success team to create communication strategies to understand how they're going to interact throughout the year, our customers are just getting more and more comfortable with engaging with a large percent of their audience on a more regular basis throughout the year. So in this particular group, leading the way is actually the lifestyle category, who interacted with a whopping 44% of their customer base throughout the year. Lagging quite far behind here is the travel category, who only interacted with 14% of their customers last year. So the reason for a lot of this is, while Apptentive customers are absolutely best of breed when it comes to customer centricity, about using their customers to guide their roadmap, things like that, a lot of our customers in the travel industry were very concerned in 2018 about being noisy and annoying to customers. So they were much more hesitant than apps in other industries to talk to a wide base of their customers. That's a huge reason for the gap of 14% interaction rate for them to the overall average of 25%. And obviously companies in the lifestyle category have just figured out exactly how to get that cadence going of talking to customers more regularly over time to create that relationship with them. So if you don't hit the benchmark and the average interaction rate, you're actually missing an opportunity to interact with customers where they already are. So people are in your mobile app, they are basically there to engage with you and to use your product. If you're not taking the time to talk to them there, you're really missing out on meeting those customers and understanding who they are, exactly where they are. So while noise is absolutely a valid concern, we urge you to also remember that in order to engage with your customers and to make them feel part of your brand, you do have to initiate that contact. And this actually becomes important in the next section, which is the response rate. So what happens when you reach out to your customers? We've found that people respond. So overall, companies that work with Apptentive saw a 91% response rate for all interactions they sent to customers. That means that for every single piece of content you put out to your customers, 91% of them are responding to you and are giving you feedback on how things are going. It's a tremendously high rate. And actually, between app categories, we didn't see much variance in response rate. So lifestyle, which you remember had a 44% interaction rate, actually has a 92.5% interaction rate across all interactions. So that's only 1.5 percentage points lower than travel, which, as you remember, are not talking to as many of their customers. So companies are really working to make sure that interactions are really relevant to their customers and that they're timely, and it's really helping them to engage with people. So what this all highlights is that if you're paying attention to the right place, right time, and right audience, you're talking to the right people, you're doing it at a time that is relevant to them, with more interactions, you won't come across as noisy or annoying. People want to interact with you. So ask yourself, what percentage of your customer base are you talking to? And more importantly, what percentage of those customers are actually responding back to you? If you're not hearing from at least a quarter of your customers, your competitors are likely outperforming you. So I have some tips that I want to go through for how to get those interaction rates up and how to get those response rates up. We're actually going to go through these tips in every single category. So first, one thing that we like to recommend is starting with a really simple question. At Apptentive, we start with a question of, do you love the app? Do you love the company? We call this the love dialogue. And it helps our customers to gauge their customer sentiment over the lifetime of the app. It's really lightweight and provides a very non-invasive way to start a dialogue with your customer. One quick question, we have, response rates here are over 90%. So basically, if you're just asking like a quick yes or no question, it's a great way to gauge how your customers are doing without requiring much from them. And we're really seeing high response rates there. The second tip here is to be in tune with your app and app experience. The surest way to tank your response rate is to reach out to customers at inopportune times. So pay attention to your app flow and stay away from talking to customers when they're in the middle of trying to complete a task. Also make sure that customers have enough experience with the app, so they've used it long enough, they've used enough features to actually provide good feedback for you. The third tip is have a communication plan. This is kind of the bread and butter of what the customer success team at Apptentive does, but really understand what you're trying to accomplish over the quarter or over the year with regards to customer feedback and communication. This will help to ensure you're spreading out that communication and speaking with a broad group of your customers over time. Having a plan makes the idea of talking to customers a lot less scary. And then the last tip I have in this area is don't be afraid to talk to more people. The way we like to explain it is think of it as a brick and mortar location. If somebody went into a store and nobody acknowledged the customer when they came in, it wouldn't be acceptable to customers at almost any type of business or for any customers. So in today's digital landscape, you have to think about your mobile device in the same way that you think about that in-app experience to stay competitive. So interacting with customers helps them along their journey and builds the relationship with you, builds the relationship with your brand. So it's up to you to actually start that conversation. The only way to do that is to be willing to talk to your customers. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Robi, who's going to talk about our love dialogue.
Thanks, Christy. So Christy talked about some of the interactions that we have, in particular pointed at the love dialogue. I'm here to talk about that because it's one of the core capabilities that we have introduced into the world and that hundreds of millions of people have interacted with. The reason this is really important is that emotional connections to your brand today matter more than ever. When we talk about customer centricity and customer love, we're not really talking about this euphemistically. We're talking about this actually. If you don't have a real emotional connection with your customers, likelihood of them leaving when they have a negative experience is really high, as we talked about earlier. So our love dialogue is a really super simple way to start understanding where your customer is on their emotional journey with you. It's a very simple question that has a yes or no answer. Do you love our company or our brand or our app experience? Are recommended questions. And just by answering that question, then we can take people on a different journey. So for many years, we've been helping brands take the evangelists on journeys to potentially rate in the App Store or to bring them into new features and take a survey about those new features, or to cross-sell or upsell or even share things on social. Conversely, when somebody says that they're not having a great time and they don't yet love your company, your brand, your experience, that's a great time to go deeper with them. So our love dialogue allows you to very quickly get an answer to this question and then continue the journey with the customer dependent upon what is really important to them and relevant. As we've done this over the years, we've seen that there are many, many different ranges of responses to this love dialogue. And in particular, across the industries that we're talking about today, we see that in finance, which is somewhat counterintuitive for many people, people have a very high love ratio. And we think that the reason around this is that financial decisions, especially the people that you choose to borrow money from or where you keep your money, are really long-term decisions. And if you're not happy, you will switch. But if you are staying with somebody on a regular basis, we're seeing really high love ratios. At the low end of the spectrum, we see that media companies tend to have a lower love ratio, oftentimes because we deal with many media companies that we consume our media from, whether they're different movie studios or television channels or potentially even going to YouTube. There are so many media choices out there that we have less loyalty and a less emotional connection overall. You'll see that the overall, right here in the middle, response or love ratio is about 68%. That's the average across all the industries that we see. So travel, shopping, and finance are above that, and food and drink, lifestyle, and media are below that. In addition to answering the love dialogue, we also ask people more detailed questions. We work with our customers to really understand sentiment across the various app categories. And so what's really important to understand about this is that you and your category are very specific. The experiences you're creating for your customers are much more competitive with one another. And so we really try to focus on comparing yourself to love ratio within your category and sentiment within your category. This is because the consumer response to the love dialogue, that yes or no question, is just the first step. And then getting into the details, so the actual feedback, whether it's open-ended messages or responses to surveys, will teach you more about the expectations your consumers have for happiness across your app category. And so then the amount of choice also really impacts this too. The final point here is that in some categories, there are only 3 or 4 players, and in others, there are hundreds. And so when we think about that choice, it also will impact sentiment. Helping customers really understand about the sentiment and the love dialogue is one of the things that we provide as a service. We help apps in all categories really identify the fans and the risks and treat them differently. We think that one of the most important things that each company should be doing is focusing on the right time and right place. So for example, in the media industry, trying to ask people's sentiment before they've consumed any of your media, maybe before they've even decided to log in with your service, is not the appropriate time. But if you are in a travel category, as they're browsing for flights, you might find that those are really meaningful and important times to ask for sentiment, because people might be struggling with your interface. So each app and each experience has its own set of right time, right place that you should be looking for. What you're really supposed to be focusing on is happier customers. So the love ratio, the benchmarks we've given you, while they are guidelines and they're useful because we have a lot of data, the love ratio is not the end all be all. Really what you're trying to do is get in front of enough customers to understand how their journey is going and to make them happier and figure out how to solve any problems. And finally, it really, really is important for you to understand and act on this changing sentiment. We think that a lot of companies measure just to measure. And as you're hearing from us talk about the benchmarks, one of the things that we say over and over again is get proactive, talk to more customers. So if you are going to get proactive and talk to more customers, you also have to put action into what you're going to do afterwards. If you do not spend enough time acting on and changing that sentiment by taking the actions necessary, you will lose customers regardless of if you're measuring. So let's talk about survey response rates. I'm going to hand this over to Christy to get into more detail.
Great. Thanks, Robi. Okay, so with survey response rates, in 2018, companies that work with Apptentive saw an all-time high survey response rate of 19%. Not only is this substantially higher than what we had seen in prior years, 13% in 2016, 17% in 2017, but it widely outperforms the average of 1% response rate that people have in different kinds of areas like email or the really long web surveys. So these companies are the companies we work with are doing something right with surveys. I'll get into some tips and tricks around how to get your actual benchmark numbers up. But I want to talk through some of the differences we see here. So we do see a varied response rate across all app categories, with finance apps receiving the highest response rate of 22% and media apps receiving the lowest at 12.5%. While higher survey response rates are always better, there are a number of reasons that you could have lower response rates without it really being a bad thing. A lot of it really depends on how you're trying to show your survey, what methodology you're using. For instance, if you want to cast a really wide net to all of your customers and just get really basic feedback from a group of customers, it's not likely going to yield as high a response rate as a highly targeted survey that's very relevant to a small number of participants. That's obviously going to have a higher response rate. So both types of surveys are incredibly useful. It's really important for you just to understand going into it what you're really trying to get out of it, what your methodology is that you're going to use. There are, though, some industry-specific reasons for differing response rates, and I'd like to talk about 3 of those right now in depth. The first is that media apps face a really difficult and unique challenge because it's hard to know the right threshold for reaching out to customers. So people consume a large amount of content on media apps when they're going through and looking at videos, reading articles, different things like that. And it can be challenging to guess the appropriate number of pieces of content that a customer's consumed at which they will have enough experience to give you feedback. So a lot of the reason that we see the lower response rate here is, really just kind of trial and error on understanding like what is that sweet spot for experience in the app to actually reach out and get feedback from people. So the tip I have here is the more data that your teams are collecting around average usage and the more they're willing to leverage that when creating their surveys, the more targeted you can be on when you should speak to somebody, what the appropriate time is, and the higher response rate you're going to have. The second thing is that when it comes to shopping or retail apps, it can be really difficult to understand timing based upon the consumption cycle. So for those apps in particular, you don't ever want to stop a customer from shopping and from buying things in your app. However, when the purchase is complete, the consumer is normally done and they're going to leave the app. So it's really hard to find that balance of like not being interruptive, but of actually getting customer feedback. So the response rates in this area in shopping can be a little lower than the average just based on that. And the best recommendation I have here is if you're an Apptentive customer, work with your customer success manager. If you're not, just really think through exactly what your business goals are and what your customer goals are and work to marry those so you're not being interruptive to the customer, but you're also getting what you want out of the survey. And then the third thing is that apps in the food and beverage and finance categories tend to be skilled at using the where targeting. So understanding for Apptentive, we allow you to have separate targeting of who you're going to connect with and then also where you're going to show the survey. And people in finance and food and beverage are very good at getting that where targeting right, which causes really high interaction rates. which causes really high response rates. They may not have as many people that see the interactions just based upon the fact that they are really targeted, but when they actually present something to somebody, they are willing to take that survey. The reason for this is because, like, take food and beverage, for example. If somebody is coming in to do like an order on the app, you don't want to interrupt that flow. You don't want to stop that person from completing that purchase. So those apps tend to have where events that are a lot more relevant to other parts of their app that maybe people hit less often, but that are not intrusive. The same is true for finance. So we see better response rates there just because they've become really skilled at getting that where location right. All right, so now I'm going to go through some tips on bumping up your survey response rates. The first is keep it short and sweet. So real estate is very limited on mobile devices, but even on a desktop, nobody wants to take the time to answer a 30-question survey. So if you can keep your questions or your surveys short and sweet, no more than 4 to 6 questions at most, that's going to be ideal. And if you can present a micro survey of just 1 question, you're going to yield higher results than trying to make somebody scroll through 30 questions. The second tip I have is have a goal in mind. So understand from the beginning what you're trying to answer with the survey. This will help you to tailor your questions to make sure that they are fitting that goal, and be really ruthless. If there's a question on there that does not help you to meet your goal, pull that question from the survey. It's just taking up screen real estate, and it's not going to help you to get high response rates. The third tip is ask for open-ended feedback. So closed-ended surveys are great where people can just pick from a list of answers, but the real value comes from allowing your customers to express themselves in free form. So adding open-ended questions will allow your customers to help you uncover issues or high points in the app that maybe your internal team was not aware of or hadn't considered. This, I can't stress enough, with our customers, this has been some of the ways that they have uncovered some unknown issues that people have with their app and app experiences. So make sure to give your customers a place where they can give you open-ended feedback. And the last tip that I have is close the loop. As often as possible, follow up with your customers who've taken surveys to let them know the results, and if you're going to be fixing some things, what features you're going to be working on. Basically just work to let them know that they're heard. The more they feel engaged with you and like their surveys are making a difference, the more willing they're going to be to give you feedback in the end. So please make sure to close the loop with your customers. All right. Now I'm going to actually talk about in-app messaging. So Apptentive offers an in-app messaging platform that we call Message Center that allows companies to talk back and forth with their customers inside the app versus having to move the conversations to email, to phone, or to another medium. And in 2018, we saw a tremendous uptick in Message Center usage with some big customers adopting the tool. Importantly, we actually saw a 76% increase in the number of customers that were talking to companies in the app from the year before. So leading the way in this area were the retail apps, who saw over 5,000 messages per app from their customers in 2018. The one thing I want to stress here is that more is not necessarily better when it comes to Message Center, and a lot of factors contribute to the volume here. So the way that you implement Message Center, whether you're using it more passively or aggressively, or actively, whether you're waiting for the customers to come to you, or you're presenting them with the ability to talk to you in Message Center, that is going to change the volume here. If you're using it as your main customer care center versus just using it as some app feedback, that's going to change volume. And then, of course, the number of people that you actually have using your app on a regular basis is going to affect this number. So we find that apps in the top 4 categories here tend to use Message Center more as their primary customer care center for their customers, while apps in places like media and food and beverage, who have very high active user counts and a more complicated relationship with the brand to like a brick and mortar location or the brand to the app, tend to use Message Center more sparingly. So the real takeaway here is just to help you to understand how apps in different categories utilize Message Center and what they're seeing as far as communication goes. But I do have some tips for you if you are thinking of using some kind of in-app messaging. So the first is, do not be afraid of two-way communication. We see this quite often, that companies, think that the volume is going to be too high, think that they're not going to be able to keep up with two-way communication. There are ways, particularly with Apptentive, but with also other tools out there, that you can set customer expectations of who you're going to respond back to, at what point you're going to respond back. You can also, as I mentioned, be more passive or more active in presenting customers with Message Center. There is a way for you to create this two-way communication loop inside your app, even with limited resources. So don't shy away from that two-way communication center or two-way communication channel just because you think the volume is going to be too high. The second tip I have is be consistent and set response expectations. This goes into what I just mentioned, but make sure that you're letting your customers know what to expect. It's actually okay to provide them with a place to give you open-ended feedback that they know you're reading and listening to, and to let them know that you can't respond to every single inquiry. Just setting that expectation helps the customer to know, what they should expect from your brand, helps them to know how things will work. And as long as you're being consistent and actually living up to those expectations, it's going to be a great experience for your customers. The third one is make it accessible. So don't bury this 10 menus deep. Make it something that is prominent to the customers, whether that be, adding on each page, like a little contact us area, or maybe in the hamburger menu of your app. Just make it easy for customers find the way to talk to you, because we know that they will go and find ways to talk to you. Either through social channels, through the App Store, different things like that. If you make it too hard, they will take their messages, their issues that they're having, to public channels where you can't really solve anything. So make sure it's easy and accessible for people to find this feedback channel. And then the last tip I have is let your customers know that their voices are heard. So even if you can't get back to people one-to-one, please make sure to close the loop with customers. If you know that people have had an issue with a particular, bug that you've had or something like that, there are ways to create groups and send out group messages to people to let them know that you fixed something. There are ways to send, blast to all of your customers to let them know about the updates and changes you're making. Again, the more you can let customers know that their problems are being addressed and that they're being heard, the more likely they are to give you feedback in the future. And of course, the more affinity they're going to feel to your brand, the more loyalty they're going to have. So make sure to follow up. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Robi to talk about star ratings.
Thanks, Christy. I love that last point. Let people know that their voices are heard. We're going to spend a little time talking about star ratings in app stores, where it's really hard to let people know that they've been heard. So we know that people pay a lot of attention to this inside of companies, that people's app store rankings, their star reviews are visible to everybody inside the company. And these days, it seems like everybody has an opinion on them, whether it's the CEO coming and asking why somebody rated you 2 stars in your newest release, or it's somebody on the marketing team coming and telling you that you really need an Apple Watch app. Everybody's got an opinion on what's going on with apps these days. And because the App Store is so visible, a lot of folks spend a bunch of time really paying attention to this. So we're going to talk to you about some of the metrics that we see and ways to contextualize them, and also to graduate to thinking harder about sentiment, not just star ratings. So first and foremost, some benchmarks around this. The food and drink category and the shopping category, which have, I think, as we've been talking about, some really vocal customers who use the apps potentially daily, if not weekly, have also commensurate a much larger volume of ratings. You can see here that on average in the food and drink category, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of ratings. But then down in the finance and media categories, we're talking about somewhere between 10 and 50,000 ratings. So much, much fewer. A lot of this has to do with frequency and competition. As we were talking about earlier, finance has really, really high love ratios because people choose a bank and stay with it for a long time. We think that's associated with loyalty and emotional connections. But as a result, people are switching less often, and when they're switching less often, they're speaking less often. So it's not uncommon to be in the finance vertical and see that your app only has 1,000 or 2,000 ratings. Conversely, if you're in the food and drink vertical and you only have 1,000 or 2,000 ratings, you probably have a meaningful problem in that you haven't really attracted enough customers and they don't care enough about you. overall, we see somewhere between 40 and 50,000 ratings as being the average on iOS by app. Reviews, you'll notice, are on a much different scale, right? So there is a difference between being able to give a star rating and then giving a full review. They are two levels of commitment, and with the introduction of in-app rating that came with iOS 11 almost 2 years ago, we've seen a real increase, especially in the iOS ecosystem, in ratings, but we've seen a decrease in reviews. And so similar to the volume that we just showed you, much higher volume in food and drink, but that volume, instead of being 150,000 reviews, we're now talking about 12 to 1,500 reviews as opposed to 150,000 ratings, sorry. And then in finance, we see hundreds of reviews, not thousands, not tens of thousands, hundreds per app. And again, this has to do with the level of commitment it takes. And in iOS, the level of commitment is pretty significant. So when we think about the App Store rating, it's just a number. It's a really simple metric. It's easy for people to tap and then move on about their day. And when we think about reviews, this is where a lot of PMs get their most meaningful information. And when you have a low volume, say less than 1,000 reviews, it's very hard to discern what's going on for your customers and why they're unhappy. This is a gap that's causing more and more frustration in the ecosystem. On Android, we see a similar dynamic, but much, much different volumes. So we see in the food and drink category, we see about 7,000 to 8,000 reviews per app. So much, much higher number of reviews per app. We think that some of this is attributable to the differences in rules between the two ecosystems, that in iOS, you can reset your entire App Store rating and reviews. And that version to version, there's a pretty significant difference, and some folks choose to delete their previous history. In Android, it's all cumulative. You cannot delete your previous history. Just last week at I/O, Android, the Google Play team announced that they're going to be doing a little bit of changes to their algorithm, but they're not going to allow you to delete your history. So we will continue to see, we think, a much larger number of reviews by app, by category. But the main takeaway here is, while the volumes of reviews in Android are higher than they are in iOS, the proportion is pretty similar. And food and drink has a much higher proportion of reviews than the average finance app. And the overall app in Android land has about 1,700 to 2,000 reviews. Let's get into this in a little bit more detail, though, because if we're going to talk just about App Store ratings, and we're talking about the fact that most of the volume lives there as opposed to the reviews, the breakdown is really interesting. And what we see in the breakdown is that you're much more likely to have one-star reviews in the food and drink category and the media categories, right? When we're talking about 17 and 13% of App Store ratings in food and drink and media are one star, you're seeing a lot of unhappy customers going to the App Store to use their voice. Conversely, in shopping, particularly the retail sector, and in travel, we've got almost 3/4, more than 3/4 of people giving 5 stars. So the folks who are going to the App Store and choosing to rate and talk about it through a number system are much higher at the 5-star end in shopping and retail. And so, you know, the key takeaway around this is, as you're thinking about your app and you're looking at your category, if your ratios do not reflect this, if they're either much better on the 5-star end or much worse on the 1-star end, there's a challenge that you're facing in public perception. You're not meeting the overall curve that is likely for your category, and that's how we would use this data. Really, what star ratings come down to, in addition to the currency that a lot of people in your company can talk to about this, is what does it do for decision making? And what we've found after doing studies year after year with consumers is that the difference between a 2-star app and a 3-star app is really meaningful. So going from a 2-star app to a 3-star app can see somewhere on the order of a 3x improvement in the conversion rate. And really, when we think about the difference between a 2-star app and a 5-star app, is that a 5-star app will see 570% increases in conversion rate versus a 2-star app. So as you're thinking about what do these numbers mean, what do these star ratings mean, when you're under 4 stars, you're losing a tremendous amount of conversion. That is, the people who come to your App Store page are much less likely to download the app. Yes, your app might be free, but it comes with a space requirement. And if people are looking at your App Store rating and it says it's 3 stars, what that says to most consumers is it's not worth my time. But if they look at it and it says 4 stars, they're 90% more likely to download that app. And that boost is pretty significant for both your paid marketing and organic marketing efforts. And it's part of the reason why both app stores will take 4-star apps and move them to the top of the list much more frequently than they will take a 3 or 3.5 star app up. So some tips around star ratings and reviews. Start by understanding your existing customer sentiment between your fans and detractors. This should, at this point, be a little bit resonant of multiple things that we've talked to you about with the love dialogue. Understanding where your customers are, whether they're fans or the detractors, is a really important way to differentiate and think about how people are going to the App Store and what they're talking about. The second piece of this, though, is if you understand that and you provide a place for your detractors to actually talk to you instead of forcing them to the App Store, you will see a difference in your App Store rating, which, as we talked about, is really important for conversion, but you're also going to get much more feedback from them. That huge gap between ratings volume and review volume is the gap of understanding that really needs to be fixed. If you are not hearing from your detractors directly inside your app, it's likely that they're not really saying enough in the App Store for you to figure out their problems. You have to intercept that feedback. You have to give people a way to talk to you very simply. You really, when you're talking about ratings and reviews, we can't stress this enough. It's not as much about the quantity as it is about the quality. Are you getting a representative sample of people to talk about you publicly? If so, that's great. That's high quality. You're understanding what's really going on, and future customers for your app are getting to understand what's going on. If you're just focused on quantity, you're more likely to end up in a place where you're not learning as much. Your team's not as sophisticated. But let's get a little bit more into that, because I've been talking about ratings. A lot of people talk about ratings, but the why behind the ratings is what's much more important. So we want to talk about sentiment and how that is distributed. You see, our tools help a lot of customers, instead of using the App Store rating function and the review function to get feedback, our tools help people to get feedback directly inside the app and understand why customers are happy or unhappy. And what we've learned is that the sentiment distribution in private feedback channels is much different from public feedback channels like App Store reviews. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when you hear from customers directly in your app using open-ended messages, you get a much richer picture of what's happening. So for example, in the shopping category, what we've seen is that there's a lot of negative feedback that is untapped. In previous screens, I was showing you that the average shopping and retail app was having, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 App Store reviews. But when they go to a private mechanism for feedback, you can see hundreds of thousands of negative comments. And these comments come with a lot more information to discern what's going on with your app and what you need to improve. Importantly, for product management teams, this is where a lot of road mapping comes in. When you're able to take out the negative reviews from your highest value customers, then you can discern where you need to go next. Conversely, there are a lot of positive pieces of feedback that are available to you that you're maybe not seeing in the App Store that can help your team understand where you're really winning and where you're differentiating. So for example, if your one-click checkout in your e-commerce app is tremendously favorable in its sentiment from customers, you and your team can feel like this is a place where we really nailed it and we can double down on our advantages. And if you're seeing a lot of negative reviews, negative feedback coming in a private manner telling you that some of your pricing is off, that can help you take some of these initiatives to the marketing and merchandising teams to understand, where is the wiggle room around pricing and how can we make a better experience. Across each and every one of these verticals, we see different ratios, so it's important for you to, again, benchmark yourself against yours. But if you look at the volume just on the negative column, you'll understand that this is not what's happening in the App Store. The public places for feedback are not giving you the richness that is available to you in a private manner. When we compare this, looking at the App Store reviews, what we're talking about here is the fact that a lot more of this stuff is tending towards the positive. So this ratio has been shifted from the previous slide where I was talking about private feedback. The public feedback has a lot more positivity and a lot shorter character length. And so again, this is an indication of how much less you're able to learn from your customers and how the ratios of feedback that show up in the App Store and in public places are really not in lockstep with what you're seeing privately. We found that customers of ours are using surveys in order to really get a lot more volume and a lot more understanding from their customers, but to do it in a way that's really customer friendly. If you think about surveys in particular, one of the things that is an advantage is that you can structure your answers. You can put out 3 or 4 choices and people can pick what's most appropriate to them. And you can give an outlet, an open-ended feedback question that will allow people to tell you more. And so then when you open up surveys, you end up getting even more feedback than you would if you're just asking for open-ended feedback the way an App Store review is or the way our message center is. So when people use our surveys and open-ended feedback, these volumes climb pretty significantly. So what we're talking about is in the shopping and retail sector, seeing potentially 130, 140,000 positive open-ended feedback responses and surveys, but then 217,000 are negative. Together, those numbers lead up to massive volume for you and your teams to make decisions based upon where your customers need you to go and what's driving their happiness. And overall, this coverage ratio then represents 15 or 20 or even 30% of your audience, as Christy was talking about earlier. So when you're thinking about sentiment, you have to think outside of the App Store. You have to think about tools to get it in a private manner that you and your team can learn from, and as a result, the volumes will increase. This is the secret power of really collecting feedback in the experience in-app. With that, we're gonna try one more listener poll. This question is gonna be, do you prioritize your mobile app as a customer feedback listening tool? What I've just shared with you, the past 10 slides, are really talking about the difference between public feedback in an app store and the ability to use your app to get private feedback. And we're curious, are you using your mobile app as a customer feedback listening tool or just monitoring reviews? Let's get this going. And that should be launched. Give you a few seconds to take a look at that and answer. And then I'm going to hand it off to Christy, who's going to take us into some more specific tips around categories and help us wrap up.
Awesome. Thanks, Robi. Okay, so now we're just going to get into the final stretch of this, which are the recommendations we have. So the first one is lifestyle. And for lifestyle, the main takeaway is don't be afraid to get creative with communication plan. As you saw really early on, our customers in the lifestyle category have really high interaction rates, which means they're talking to a lot of their customers. The reason for this is they are getting creative and they're finding a lot of different ways to talk to their customers, creating communication plans. If you're an Apptentive customer, talk to your customer success manager about this, but just don't hesitate, even if you're a product team, to really spend some time asking different customers different things or telling them about different things that you're working on. So spend that time to get creative on that communication plan. Also, regularly survey customers to gauge sentiment. One thing we do know about these categories is that they have really high sentiment, but that can change over time. So make sure you're talking to your customers throughout the year about how that sentiment is changing and finding that over time so you can know whether you're doing better or worse, just how you're comparing over time. And then the last is proactively provide in-app messages for quick announcements. This ties into the communication plan, but make sure if you're making any changes or you have anything new for them to discover, take the time to create some in-app messaging to let customers know about that. We know from response rates that your customers respond really well to those. So just don't be afraid to provide those in-app messages just to keep your customer apprised of what you're doing. Next, we have finance apps. So in this, first of all, let customers drive your product roadmap. So with finance in particular, we found out that asking people what you'd like them to build or what they'd like you to build next or what you should be focusing on is really fruitful for finance apps. So make sure you're letting customers have a say in what you're going to focus on, what you're going to prioritize. That will allow you to save money on dev and to create the things that people are actually going to use. The second one, this might be kind of obvious, but offer strong security, especially if you're using something like two-way messaging. Make sure you have a way to kind of federate if there are two people using a device, so you're only talking to that one person, and make sure that the customer understands that any feedback they provide to you is going to be safe and secure. And then the last thing is be proactive. Don't wait for them to come and talk to you. Again, because customers are a little bit more locked into their choices for financial apps, they maybe don't think that they have as much say in the roadmap and things like that. They're not going to reach out and give you as much feedback. So make sure you're taking the time to be proactive with them. Next, we have media. Leverage in-app messaging to promote real-time content. So we have a lot of our media customers who like to do this. If they have something like, if they're a news app and they are promoting, anything to do with elections, if they are more of, an entertainment app and they're covering award shows or anything like that, use in-app communication to help promote those different things and get customers to the areas they need to be in your app to see the content you really want them to see. The second one is provide login support, and this is pretty specific to media apps. For most media apps that we work with, there is probably like a cable provider that they're working with, that the person has to log into that cable provider site in order to get the media content. Make sure that you're providing support for these people, because that process can be really frustrating. It's not necessarily something that you, the company, the app owns, but it is something that's really frustrating for your customers and something that they're going to equate as your problem, even if it's not. So make sure that as people are trying to log in, you're offering some kind of support to them in case they have trouble with that. And then the last is invest in understanding customer habits. This goes back to the response rates for surveys and things like that, but understand how much content your customers are consuming, and make sure that you're making decisions about when to talk to customers based on those habits and when would be an appropriate time. Next is retail. For this, provide a mobile payment option. This is not necessarily a communication plan, but if you are not providing a way for people to make purchases inside your app or in a brick and mortar store, you are falling behind your competitors. This is something that people have come to expect, and if you're not investing in this from an app technology standpoint, you are falling behind. The next is offer a consolidated digital experience. So ensure that whatever you're doing on the mobile web or on the app is really similar to what you're providing them in other areas. And then the last is replace manual tours with digital solutions. So this one, just make sure that you're not asking people to go above and beyond to do things like find different sizes, to find different products. Make sure that you're providing a really easy digital solution that people would have to do manually before, either by going into stores or by searching your web. Give them options there. And then on to food and beverage. The first is acknowledge and nurture customer loyalty. If you have the capacity to have a customer loyalty program, this is a really great way to ensure that customers are loyal to you. Make sure that they know that they're a valued customer. If you can give them incentives for being more loyal, please make sure to do that. The next is pay special attention to where your customers, to where you're choosing to speak to customers. I spoke on this a little earlier, but because a lot of customers in food and beverage are using the app to actually make purchases, just ensure that you're not stopping that flow. First of all, you could lose a sale. Second of all, you're just going to make a customer angry. So pay attention to where you're talking to customers. And then lastly, keep your foot on the gas when it comes to 5-star ratings. As Robi mentioned, people have a lot of options when it comes to food and beverage. They will easily and happily switch to a different competitor if you're not providing them with good service. And a lot of the ways that people decide whether or not to download an app is by going to the App Store and seeing how you're comparing with your competitors. So make sure you do have a plan in place to get your 5-star ratings up, and make sure that you are focused and putting your foot on the gas on getting those going. And then lastly, we will talk about travel apps. First of all, don't be afraid to engage with your customers. This goes out specifically to our customers in the category. We showed you today that talking to customers more does not hurt your response rates. So make sure that you are taking the time to create that relationship with your customer in your digital platform. Make sure you are taking the time to talk to them. Don't be afraid of talking to more of them. Analyze your in-app engagement. So make sure you're actually taking the time to understand how customers are using different parts of your app and how you're speaking with them is working in those areas. So make sure you understand, engaging with them at this certain time, certain place, is that working really well? This is important for travel apps because customers have really specific reasons for using apps, and they are varied. Whereas for food and beverage, they may only use the app to complete a purchase. For travel apps, they could be checking a lot of different places. So make sure you're taking the time to understand usage patterns and how in-app engagement is working in those different areas. And then the last is engage with customers on social media channels. If you work in the travel industry, you know that customers, I am super guilty of this, but they take a lot of time if they're having troubles, or even if they're having a good time, to tweet at you, to message you on Facebook, different things like that. Make sure you have a plan to respond to those customers, because they are reaching out to you in a really public way. The more you can create a good experience there, the more loyal they're going to be to your brand, even if they've had a bad experience. All right, so now I wanted to give just a couple takeaways that apply to all app categories, and then we will switch over to some questions. So the first is, regardless of app category, being customer-centric is not an option anymore. It is required. If you are not thinking of your customer when you are building an app, if you are not actually engaging and talking to people where they are, you are falling behind your competitors. It is expected by consumers at this point that if you are a customer-facing brand, that you are actually going to be engaging with them on a regular basis. It's not optional. The next one, customers expect to be interacted with, and those interactions heavily influence retention. We talked about this really early on, but customers who are interacted with are 4 times more likely than customers who are not to stay in your app 3 months later. People expect, just like in a brick and mortar store, for you to meet them where they are and to create a relationship and talk to them. If you are not doing that, you are going to not retain those customers as heavily. And the next one is, you can't be customer-centric without developing a deep understanding of your customers. We've touched on this over and over again, but if you don't understand exactly how your customers are going in and using your app, what they find useful in your app versus in person, different things like that, you're not going to be able to make decisions that are best for them. I talked about this in the finance area, but if you don't understand the things that you're missing that customers expect to be able to do in the app, you're not going to be able to build those things. So make sure you understand how your customers are using your app. Make sure you understand who your customers are. Make sure you're talking to them about what they want. You can't be customer-centric without doing that. The next one is, brands across categories are putting more effort into communicating with customers. This should be pretty obvious from this entire webinar, but people expect you to communicate with them, and brands are getting more and more comfortable with this. So if you're a brand that's a little more hesitant, not sure how to start this communication, I encourage you, to reach out to your CSM if you are an Apptentive customer, or to have an internal discussion or a discussion with the company you are working with in this way. If you are not an Apptentive customer, but you are going to get beat out if you are not willing to get comfortable communicating with your customers. The very last takeaway is that if you're not close to the benchmarks in these categories, you're falling behind. So take that into mind. Really try to assess yourself after this webinar to figure out if there are areas you're falling behind, and figure out if it's important to you and important to your brand to not fall behind your competitors in that area. Okay, so that's it. So before you go, again, I just want to reiterate that we do have a full benchmark report. We have the link to it here. Please take the time to just look into the benchmark report. We do have some more specific information in there. For instance, things are broken down between Android and iOS for all of these different categories. So if you wanted to see the difference between those two, that's going to be in there. With that, I know we are running low on time, but I'm going to turn things back over to Victoria.
Perfect. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Robi. I personally feel like I learned a lot in that. It was so great. Thank you so much for presenting that. We've had a ton of listener engagement as well, which is always really excited. And although we are at time, we are going to have Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and slip those into the Q&A, which is at the bottom center of your screen, and we'll get those answered for you. And also, as a reminder, and as Christy said, we will be sharing out the links for today's recording and to the full app category benchmark report in our follow-up email. So please keep an eye out for those from me. And with that, we'll get into some listener questions.
All right, it looks like the first question is, actually, I just want to acknowledge there were a lot of health and wellness focused questions by listeners. Asking if we have the specific data that we went through today for that category. We didn't actually prepare that for the study today, but we can actually look into it deeper for that particular category after the webinar, and can follow up with you all directly after the webinar with some more information for your category. So thank you so much for your questions. They were definitely heard. We just don't have that data available for this call, but can get that for you. So the actual question I'm going to answer is, if the company doesn't fall into one of these categories, what benchmark data should you use? You can definitely use, if it's not health and wellness, which we just said we will go and look into, you can definitely use the overall benchmark information. Also, if you're an Apptentive customer, reach out to your CSM. This is a lot of the information we go through in business reviews. We provide this information for you, but the overall benchmark webinar or overall benchmark report will actually provide you some really good guidance. It's not just.
Awesome. I'm going to take another question that we got here. We hear this a lot. What kind of incentives can we give to increase survey engagement? So this question comes to us a ton in two different ways. One is, how do we incentivize better ratings and reviews in the App Store? The second is, how do we incentivize people giving us feedback? Our answer to this is, you don't need to do either if you are finding the right time and right place. When we're talking about hearing from 15, 20, 30% of your customers, that's coming actually without any incentives at all, but by doing it the right way. Christy gave a lot of really good tips on survey creation. Number one, keep it concise and short. And so what we found is really high response rates come from targeting it at the right time and right place. We are not fans of incentivizing responses to customer surveys, in particular because a lot of the research shows that those incentives alone will influence the results in a way that make them much harder to really trust. The second reason, and I think a lot of you probably are coming from large companies, if you run a survey with customers that has an incentive and other folks do not agree with the outcome of the survey, the first place that they will go attack the credibility of the survey is because it was incentivized. So don't get yourself in that hot water. You really, with good targeting, good personalization, and well-designed questions for your customers, will get high response rates on their own.
All right, the next question is, what's the ideal time to ask the love ratio question post-install? And is there a recommended frequency? I love this question because it means you're actually thinking about good times to communicate with customers. So we would recommend, not necessarily an amount of time after the customer has installed the app for you to ask the love question. We would recommend it being based on actions that people have taken. So in your targeting, make sure that you are understanding, what does it mean to maybe a customer to get to first success in your app, and use that as your targeting, or what are some of the major functions that people can do in the app. Make sure that somebody has experienced those things before you reach out to them and ask them if they're loving their experience. As far as frequency, we love that Apple put in the Apple rating dialog, which has a frequency of 3 times a year. And we actually base our recommendations for the love dialog on this. You do want to be asking customers over time if they're happy, because you don't want to assume that they're not going to change their mind. A lot of them are. So if you're asking about 3 times a year or about every 90 to 120 days, generally speaking, that's not going to be too intrusive to the customer, but it's going to give you a good gauge over time as to how their sentiment might be changing.
Awesome. I've got another question here that was asked while we were going through the response rates by the app category. So going back to some of those slides, which was what constitutes contact? How should we be thinking about these numbers? And to get a little bit more specific, when we think about contact, we think about reaching out to 100 people. That's 100 contacts. And then if 30 of those people responded to the survey, then that's the response rate. So the contact is really the number of people you've targeted, that you've asked the question, that saw that question or saw a note or a message from us. And then the response rate is how many take action and actually do respond to the survey, in this example where that would be 30%.
Great. The next question we have is, do you have response rate for iOS and Android separately? We do, and that is actually in the full benchmark report that I mentioned. We break things out there by OS. And just to kind of give everybody a teaser, response rates tend to be a little lower on Android than they are on iOS, but take a look at that report if you want detailed information.
Great. Another question about sort of the methodology and the numbers. Is the average ratings or reviews over a certain time period or lifetime average? And right now it is the lifetime average is what we're looking at. We do have, as Christy referenced, more detailed breakdowns of some of these stats that can get into annual. So if this is a place where you'd like more information, please follow up with us and we can answer that for you.
All right, the next one is, what are your recommendations about removing one-star reviews from being featured by App Store? That is a really good question. Unfortunately, companies don't have a lot of say over what the App Store actually features as far as reviews and things like that. So I don't have a good recommendation for actually removing those from being reviewed. One thing I will recommend is that the more you can get the volume of good reviews and good ratings up, the less likely the App Store is to actually feature that. And one thing I'm really excited about, Android's announced that they are going to start weighting their reviews and ratings by the time that they were submitted. So that is actually going to be a great place for us, because the more you start to ask your customers and engage with them and get them to go and leave that feedback, the more it's going to push those more negative responses out. So we're really looking forward to this Android release, which will place more weight on newer things. So maybe if you had a bad app release or something like that, are actually going to help you to highlight things. But recommendation is just, again, getting that volume up for good ratings. Also, we've mentioned this, but make sure you have a place for customers to go to leave bad feedback. Most of the time that they're going to the App Store and giving that negative review, it's because you haven't given them a place to give it to you directly. They would much rather give it to you directly so you can actually address it than just put it into this abyss that is the App Store. So provide them with a place to actually talk to you directly.
Awesome. All right, we have one last question and then we're gonna close this down. Thank you for your patience and staying with us 10 minutes afterwards. We have our contact information here up on the screen, so if you did not get your question answered or you have others, please do not hesitate to email us, and we appreciate feedback. Hopefully that's obvious about anything we could have done better or did not touch on that would have been useful for you. So with that, the last question is, are there any insights you have with regards to messaging for games or kid-focused apps? And yes, this is absolutely a sensitive area. You do not want to actually be interacting with kids in a manner that runs afoul of any of the privacy laws of your country. And so our recommendations around things that might get in front of underage people is, oftentimes those apps have a parents area, like for administration, that's behind a login where the parents can actually manage the billing information or any private information that's necessary. If your app has a section like that, you can target your feedback collection to just the parents. But if you do not have a section like that, we would encourage you to be thinking about that in your design. Unfortunately, if you do not have a section that is relegated to just people of age, collecting feedback is a much more tenuous area for you to delve into, and in that regard, only surveys with no open-ended comments would be acceptable in order to ask questions. But again, that's a place where you're going to want to defer to your privacy lawyers around even vetting those questions. With that, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you for spending some time with us today and learning more about communication benchmarks in the mobile space. Hopefully you took away some useful information, and remember, be proactive, get in front of your customers, talk to them. They're waiting to hear from you. Thank you.